Hello, and welcome to this talk, Augments in Ihanzu, which I will be presenting, but which reflects work conducted by both myself as well as my colleague Jutta Hartmann at Bielefeld University. For some visual context, I'll start this talk with some video of a ride through Isene village, a community in the heart of the Ihanzu-speaking area. By way of an abstract, augments in Ihanzu are a set of nominal prefixes which are extremely common but whose function is rather unclear. This talk presents progress from ongoing collaborative research on the Ihanzu augment and provides some hypotheses on the precise morphosyntactic characteristics of this grammatical category. Following a brief introduction to the Ihanzu language, and following a helpful organizational framework laid out in Van de Velde 2019, the formal properties of the augment in Ihanzu are presented, followed by its functional properties. Occasionally, brief typological summaries are given, placing Ihanzu in a larger cross-Bantu context. It will be shown that the Ihanzu augment does not seem sensitive to distinctions of definiteness or specificity, nor to nouns which are semantically inherently referential. Instead, and through examining the augment's behavior with nouns used to refer, the augment in Ihanzu seems best characterized as interacting with aboutness topicality. Specifically, augments in Ihanzu cannot occur on constituents which cannot be aboutness topics. Conversely, augments are permitted and, at least in one case, obligatorily present on constituents with topic status. Further research is necessary to confirm this topicality hypothesis, but these observations provide a useful basis for beginning to understand these pervasive but difficult to define morphemes. As a note, this talk will be made openly accessible online shortly after its live presentation, both archived at Zenodo with the DOI on screen, as well as watchable directly on YouTube via the channel link QR code on screen. I make use of a handful of QR codes throughout this talk, so if you're interested, please feel free to scan and follow. For a bit further context, my work with speakers of Ihanzu began in 2016, when I met Mr. Onesmo Dadi, pictured here with his wife, at his house in Singida town. I conducted some initial elicitation, as well as made some further connections in the Ihanzu-speaking area, located in the very north of the region. 2 years later, I made a first trip to the Ihanzu-speaking area, where I spent most of my time in Ibaga town, conducting extensive elicitation with a handful of speakers. This is an image of Isaac Showery and Musa Gimbi participating in an image-matching game designed to collect adjectives, question forms, and bird names. Late 2019 marked the beginning of a documentation project funded by the Endangered Languages Documentation Project, in which 2 members of the community were trained in ethical audiovisual language documentation. These 2 local researchers then spent the next 2 years working with their friends, family, and neighbors to collect songs, stories, procedural explanations, and other rich verbal genres. The image here is of insider researcher Sarah Kalayel working with John Kipimo. From 2021 to 2024, I traveled to Tanzania every summer to convene a field methods course at Bielefeld University, in which participants, through the internet telephony software Zoom, could conduct linguistic elicitation with an Ihanzu speaker. These month-long intensive courses always ended in an Ihanzu symposium in which participants presented their findings as short talks, most of which are available online. Here is a screen capture of one such Zoom session in which I am sitting with our chief consultant, Mr. Nicholas Nalingigwa Gideon, in the top right. It is in the context of this collaboration with Bielefeld University that I began working with Jutta Hartmann on this Ihanzu augment project. As a note, all of the recordings produced during this research are archived with the Endangered Languages Archive, ELAR, and are openly accessible for consultation online. Ihanzu itself is spoken in north-central Tanzania, in the very north of the Singida administrative region. Communities where Ihanzu is primarily spoken are indicated here in blue. Geographically, the Ihanzu-speaking area is hilly in the center and then spreads out onto a large plain in all directions, bounded by the escarpment of the Nyilamba Plateau to the west and the Mbulu Plateau escarpment to the east. Other than these geographic boundaries, there are no physical delimitations, and Ihanzu blends imperceptibly into the Nyilamba-speaking communities to the south, and by the time we arrive in the Simiyu region to the north, communities are primarily Sukuma-speaking. Genetically, Ihanzu is a Bantu language, specifically of a group of languages known as the Takama branch of Bantu. This includes very large languages such as Sukuma and Nyamwezi, together spoken by around 10 million people, as well as very small languages such as Kimbu, spoken by closer to 50,000 people. One can see from the table that there exists some fairly strong lexical correspondences between these languages, but this is looked at in more detail in the 2021 talk I reference on screen. In terms of language use and attitudes, Ihanzu has around 26,000 speakers, and its usage is certainly declining as its speakers switch to using the national lingua franca, Swahili. In my experience, Ihanzu speakers do not see their language in a negative light. The idea of maintaining their language is often submerged in homogenizing discourses of progress and modernization, almost as if the loss of the language is a prerequisite or at least an unavoidable consequence of development. For a sense of what the Ihanzu language looks and sounds like, I would now like to play a short recording of local researcher Sarah Kalayel here at the right, speaking to Rehema Rajabu at the left about a rainmaking ritual.
Ngano ele ale mesempo lya olembula.
Embula ke sempo lya omongwe noalela. Omongwe ulele no taki. Ake nungamungu ake ndiri. No taki. Paku iro bume. Imatutra kerakara. Aparu kange asage emasungwe du. Amungu kawaririshi wa kirengera changa u. Wirela kawa kirengera. Mungu gotenda golian honi.
So, having now introduced the talk, as well as provided some further context on myself and on the language, I would like now to introduce the set of morphemes that will be central to our talk today, that is, the Ihanzu augment. So, what are augments? Well, a good starting point is this definition given in Velde 2019, which says, the term augment, also initial vowel or prefix, is used by Bantuists to refer to an element that precedes the class prefix of nouns and some adnominal or nominalized modifiers, and that changes neither the class assignment of the noun nor its lexical meaning, nor the syntactic positions it can occupy. Take this Ihanzu phrase, for example, Umuhumba adzumikuirimpiti. The boy had hit the hyena. Here we have two augments, one on each argument. So we have the morpheme o prefixed to the subject noun muhumba, boy, and the morpheme e prefixed to the object noun mpiti, hyena. They take different forms because they agree with their heads in noun class. So because boy is a class 1 noun, the augment is also in class 1. Because hyena is a class 9 noun, the augment is also in class 9. Here is a table with examples of the forms taken by the augment in Ihanzu. For every noun class which is primarily nominal in nature, there is an augment, either o or e. The augments present in our example, class 1 and class 9, are highlighted here. By way of a brief comparison among other Bantu languages, the shape of the Ihanzu augment system falls along a cline. At one end, there are argument systems whose augments are consonant-vowel sequences. These are the systems present in Luguru and Gusi. Next are augment systems, which are only composed of vowels. Of these vowel systems, so-called full augment systems consist of 3 vowels. The augment system of Rundi is like this. As shown, the Ihanzu system is composed only of vowels, but there are 2 rather than 3. This would be called a partially reduced augment system. Fully reduced vowel augment systems are composed of only 1 vowel and are present in languages including Hunde. Some languages do not have augments present as segments, but their vestigial presence is detectable in tonal patterns. This kind of system is represented in Makua, and we label this inherent. Finally, other Bantu languages have no trace of an augment system, such as Swahili. We'll call these 0. Returning now to Ihanzu, an important aspect of the augment system is that very frequently the augment is optional. That is, a given phrase may feature nouns with the augment, as in the first example, or it may not, as in the second example, with no difference in meaning and no difference in grammaticality. As such, umuhumba adzumikurimpiti, which features augments, and muhumba adzumikuire which does not feature augments, are both grammatical and, as far as I have been able to determine, mean the exact same thing. With that said, and central to our discussion today, the occurrence or non-occurrence of the augment in Ihanzu is not always superfluous. Take, for example, the copular phrase, umuhumba munihanzu, the boy is an Ihanzu person. Note that the predicate noun phrase does not feature an augment. In fact, when we try to pronounce this phrase with an augment present on the predicate noun phrase, so umuhumba umunihanzu, with an intended meaning of the boy is an Ihanzu person, as here, the phrase is considered ungrammatical. The same goes for the modifier noun phrase in this phrase, umuhumba adzumikurimpiti kidaudau. The boy had hit the hyena in the morning. Note that the modifier noun does not occur with the augment. And when we produce a version of this phrase with the augment present on the modifier noun, it too is considered ungrammatical. However, if we produce a third version of this phrase, ikidaudau umuhumba adzumikurimpiti, this time with the nominal modifier at the beginning rather than at the end, it can occur with the augment and the result is entirely grammatical. This tells us that far from being entirely superfluous, the argument is sensitive to the morphosyntax. The remainder of this talk will focus on characterizing what this sensitivity may be. In this process, we again stick pretty closely to an organizational framework laid out in Velde 2019. And we'll start by examining whether the Ihanzu augment is sensitive to definiteness or specificity. Now, as Velde 2019 warns, equating augments with definiteness or specificity in other Bantu languages has a long history, the most common instantiation of which is to see an augmented form in the Bantu language listed with a translation in, say, English or French with the definite article and an augmentless form translated with an indefinite article. Very often, little further explanation is given. A further methodological question may be asked of the data at hand, which I should say was primarily elicited by me providing phrases in Swahili and then the speaker providing a translation in Ihanzu. Swahili does not feature a definite or indefinite article, so how is it that we can be sure that the phrase we are providing as input to the language consultant will be interpreted as definite or indefinite? The best solution we went with was to test cases in which there is a high probability of a given argument to be interpreted as definite. So in this phrase, umuhumba numunanso aingie mihaka umuhumba akamikuempiti. The boy and the girl had gone into the forest, and the boy hit the hyena. There is a high probability that the subject of the second clause will be definite, because the boy of the second clause will probably be interpreted as the same boy as in the first clause. In this example, we see the second instance of boy can occur with the augment. And here, umuhumba numunanso aingie mihaka, muhumba akamikwimpiti. The boy and the girl had gone into the forest and the boy hit the hyena. We can see that the second instance of the boy occurs without an augment. Both of these example phrases are grammatical, and from as far as we can tell, there is no difference in meaning between the two. The same lack of distinction occurs in this example, malunde alimi lilyoa. Here, we test definiteness by employing a noun which has unique reference, that is, the sun. This is another environment where one could expect that, in this case, the sun would be definite. As we can see, once again, there is no difference in grammaticality or of meaning if the noun the sun occurs with or without the augment. A final environment featuring a noun with a high probability of being interpreted as definite is this one, umuhumba numulipo mbele adzu chemwe. The tallest boy sneezed, where the boy is now a superlative and where an indefinite interpretation, that is, a tallest boy, is unlikely. Once again, here is a form without the augment, muhumba numolipu mbele adzu chemwe. And once again, we can see that the augment may or may not occur. Both phrases are grammatical, and there is no distinction in semantics as far as I could test. Therefore, as far as definiteness or specificity goes, it can be surmised from the data that the Ihanzu argument is probably not sensitive to either. From a comparative perspective, this makes Ihanzu different from the Bantu languages Dzamba and Bemba, which have both been argued to feature augments which are sensitive to definiteness or specificity. Moving on, we will now look at the propositional act of referring, and we'll start by looking at whether augments in Ihanzu are sensitive to inherently referential nouns. A good example of inherently referential nouns are personal names, as by nature, they typically function to pick out a person. As can be seen here, personal names in Ihanzu may occur with an augment, and most importantly for us, the augment seems optional. So we have the phrase Uandrea ukuuduma uwewe. Andrew is looking for you, versus Andrea ukuuduma uwewe. The same, Andrew is looking for you. That is, there is no difference in meaning or grammaticality if the personal name occurs with or without the augment. As such, as far as inherently referential nouns are concerned, augments in Ihanzu are not sensitive to them. This makes Ihanzu different from Rundi, where, for example, proper names do not feature augments. We can now move on from inherently referential nouns to nouns used to refer. The difference between the two concepts being that most nouns are not inherently referential, but achieve referentiality through how they occur in the phrase. As such, this investigation marks the point where we leave strictly semantics and we begin to explore morphosyntax. We'll start with vocatives. These are special forms which are used to address an entity and not to refer to an entity. So in Ihanzu, the vocative is indicated by a tone shift operation, which we can see here on the noun tata, father, which in the vocative becomes tata. When looking through my corpus of Ihanzu natural speech, no vocative form featured an augment. Now, absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, so this does need to be tested, but right now, based on the data which shows the augment and the vocative never co-occurring, it seems safe to assume that the form below would be ungrammatical and that the augment cannot occur with the vocative. We return now to the example given above of the predicative noun phrase. Predicative nouns, again, do not refer. And once again, we see that the augment cannot occur on the predicate noun phrase. A third example involves nouns which operate as modifiers. This phrase is a type of compound form composed of owner and field. In these kinds of constructions, the second element is a modifying noun. That is, the field is not referring to a field as such, but the field is serving as a modifier for owner, giving us more information as to what kind of owner this is. It's a field owner. Once again, we can see that the augment cannot co-occur with this non-referential noun. For a final example in this series, we return to the example given earlier with an adverbial modifier, in this case the noun in the morning. This is not referential from an argument perspective, and once again, in this configuration, it cannot co-occur with the augment. Returning to our set of dimensions, it seems as if the answer to this one is yes. Augments in Ihanzu are sensitive to referentiality, namely that they do not occur with nouns which do not refer. From a comparative perspective, this would put Ihanzu in the same category as Bemba, Gusi, and Zulu. However, and as those of us who can remember back to the beginning of this investigation might recall, the story is a bit more complicated. Yes, Ihanzu augments are sensitive to referentiality, but we have further patterns to account for. We left off noting that when the adverbial modifier noun occurs with the augment, the phrase is ungrammatical. However, when the adverbial noun occurs at the beginning of the clause and not at the end, it may or may not occur with the augment. So what is going on here? The steps toward a solution lie in going a bit deeper than simply referentiality. In fact, the augment in Ihanzu is sensitive to referentiality and another quality, topic referentiality. By way of definition, Reinhardt, 1981, says that the topic is the expression whose referent the sentence is about. We will now explore a final series of data to see how the augment interacts with aboutness topicality. Consider the phrase, Ete umuhumba adzumupe munanso ne imbugulu. Had the boy given the girl the bag, which means had he given her the bag as opposed to giving it to someone else. Keeping an eye specifically on the question particle ne, we can see that the element to which it attaches becomes the focus of the phrase. In this case, with the ne on the noun girl, the question is specifically asking had the boy given the bag to the girl or had he given it to someone else. Compare this now to the similar phrase, Ete umuhumba adzumupe umunanso mbugulune. Had the boy given the girl the bag, as opposed to giving her something else, in which the particle ne now occurs on the noun bag. If we try to add an augment to the argument which hosts the particle ne, the result is ungrammatical. That is, the two cannot co-occur on the same argument. The same applies to the example in which it is the argument the bag which bears the ne particle. If we try to put them together, the co-occurrence results in ungrammaticality. Another instantiation of the exact same underlying mechanism is the patterning of the augment and the suffix ke, which is also a type of question marker, this time imparting a sense of which on the noun to which it attaches. Consider the phrase, muhumba adzmu peumonanso mbogulo ke, which bag had the boy given to the girl? When we try a version in which the augment occurs on the same noun as ke, the result is ungrammatical. So we can also move back to our predicative noun phrase example, and we can see once again as a reminder that when the augment is on the predicative noun phrase, this is ungrammatical. A further reminder is from our modifier noun phrase example. We can see once again that when the augment attaches to the modifier, the result is ungrammaticality. To summarize then, what we have established thus far is that vocatives, predicate noun phrases, and most modifiers cannot occur with the augment. This is because none of these forms can function as arguments, and therefore they cannot refer. What gets us a step further is the inclusion of the focused elements to this list. The commonality then is not that these forms are not arguments, as the focused elements here are both certainly arguments, but that none of these forms can be aboutness topics. As such, what we concurrently say about aboutness topicality is that forms which cannot be aboutness topics cannot have augment morphology. This begs a question whose answer would go some way to complete this story, and that is the inverse true? That is, must forms which are aboutness topics occur with augment morphology? We actually have some tantalizing data. Returning to our data on the adverbial noun phrase, which we will remember is not an argument, we will remember that if it occurs at the end of the phrase, it cannot occur with an augment. But if it occurs at the beginning of the phrase, it can either occur with or without the augment. Even more strikingly, fronted objects require the augment, as can be seen in the example below. When the construction is pronounced without the augment, it is judged ungrammatical. The reason that I called this data tantalizing is that in both of these constructions, the material of interest is fronted, and that fronted elements are likely to have topic status. I say likely here because it is not obligatory that non-argument elements like the fronted adverbial noun phrase be topics in this position. This, in fact, may be why the augment seems optional here. In the version with the augment, the adverbial may be a topic and therefore must occur with the augment, whereas in the version without the augment, the adverbial noun is not an argument and therefore cannot occur with the augment. But this, of course, remains to be tested. Until we can test these details, this final observation must remain a question mark. To conclude, this talk sets out to interpret newly collected data on augment morphology in Ihanzu. As was hinted at in the typological summaries provided periodically along the way, the Bantu languages employ augments to encode a variety of concepts, including definiteness and specificity, as well as referentiality in a semantic and in a more structural or morphosyntactic sense. Through looking at a range of data, we hypothesize that the Ihanzu augments can encode aboutness topicality. This is because forms which cannot be aboutness topics cannot occur with augment morphology, though the inverse, that forms which are aboutness topics must occur with augment morphology, has not been fully investigated. Before I finish, I would like to acknowledge some important people. So first of all, Nicholas Nalingigwa Gideon was the main consultant for most of the directed elicitation on the augment, and his careful judgments and frequent explanations were central to coming to the understanding we now have. Local researchers Samuel Isia and Sarah Kalael were and continue to be the engines behind the processing of natural speech texts, which is a central aspect of the larger project. Images of Mr. and Mrs. Onesmo Dadi, Isaac Shauri, Musa Gimbi, John Kipimo, and Rehema Rajabu all appeared in this talk, and I would like to acknowledge them here for that. Participants in the Bielefeld University Introduction to Field Methods courses engaged in research over the space of 4 years and have often provided the context in which this particular topic could be investigated. And finally, a thanks to all the Ihanzu people for sharing aspects of their language and culture with me, and now with you too. Thank you, and here are my references.